The rain drummed against the windows of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic and positioned his bearskin hat with practiced precision. At 23 years old, he had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 2 years, and the weight of tradition rested heavily on his shoulders. Every morning, he reminded himself of the sacred duty he carried, to protect the royal family and maintain the dignity of the crown through unwavering discipline and absolute adherence to protocol. The tourists had begun gathering early despite the gray London morning. Mitchell could see them through the palace gates, cameras ready, children pressed against the iron bars with wide eyes full of wonder. Among them stood a small girl, perhaps 7 years old, clutching a worn teddy bear against her chest. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a faded blue coat that had seen better days. What struck Mitchell most was her stillness. While other children bounced with excitement and chattered loudly, she remained perfectly quiet, watching the guards with an intensity that seemed far beyond her years. The girl's mother stood beside her, occasionally glancing at her phone and checking the time. Mitchell noticed the woman's nervous energy, the way she kept smoothing her daughter's hair and whispering reassurances. Something about their presence felt different from the usual tourist visits. There was a purpose here, a quiet desperation that made Mitchell's chest tighten with concern. As the morning progressed, the crowd shifted and changed, but the little girl remained in the same spot. Mitchell found his attention drawn to her repeatedly, though he maintained his stoic expression and rigid posture. The Queen's Guard was trained never to break character, never to acknowledge the public directly. They were living statues, symbols of British tradition and military precision. Yet something about this child's patient vigil tugged at his consciousness. During his brief rest period, Mitchell learned from his fellow guards that the girl had been there the previous day as well, standing in the same spot with the same quiet determination. Guardsman Peters mentioned seeing her early in the morning, before the tourist crowds arrived. Guardsman Williams noted that she never seemed to eat or drink anything, despite the long hours she spent watching the palace gates. When Mitchell returned to his post, he observed the girl more carefully. Her clothes, while clean, showed signs of wear. Her shoes were scuffed, and her coat pocket had been mended with careful stitches. The teddy bear she carried was clearly beloved, its fur worn smooth from countless hugs, one eye slightly loose, and a small patch sewn over what might have been a tear. These details painted a picture of a family of modest means, making their presence at the palace all the more intriguing. The afternoon brought a brief respite from the rain, and with it more visitors. A school group arrived, children in matching uniforms chattering excitedly about the palace and the guards. The little girl watched them with interest but never joined their enthusiasm. She seemed content to observe, to wait, though Mitchell couldn't fathom what she might be waiting for. As the day wore on, Mitchell noticed the girl's mother becoming increasingly agitated. She made several phone calls, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Once, Mitchell saw her wipe away tears while her daughter wasn't looking. The woman kept checking her watch and scanning the crowd, as if expecting someone who never arrived. The most striking thing about the little girl was her eyes. They held a maturity that seemed impossible for someone so young, a sadness that spoke of experiences no child should have to endure. When she looked at the guards, Mitchell sensed she wasn't seeing the pageantry or the spectacle that drew most visitors. She was seeing something else entirely, perhaps safety, perhaps hope, perhaps a symbol of stability in what might be a very uncertain world. Near closing time, as the crowds began to thin, the girl's mother approached her daughter with obvious reluctance. They had a brief, whispered conversation, and Mitchell saw the child shake her head firmly. Whatever her mother was suggesting, the girl was having none of it. She clutched her teddy bear tighter and planted her feet more firmly on the ground. Her mother looked around helplessly, then made another phone call, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to keep quiet. Mitchell's shift was nearly over when he noticed the girl do something that would haunt him for the rest of the evening. She raised her small hand and pressed it against her heart, then extended it toward the palace gates in what looked like a silent salute. It was such a solemn, adult gesture from such a small person that Mitchell felt something shift inside his chest. The gesture was repeated twice more, each time with the same careful precision, the same quiet dignity. As darkness began to fall and the palace gates prepared to close for the night, Mitchell watched the girl and her mother finally walk away. The child looked back over her shoulder 3 times, each glance lingering on the guards with an expression Mitchell couldn't quite interpret. Was it disappointment, determination, or perhaps a promise to return? That evening, Mitchell found himself unable to shake the image of the little girl's silent salute. He lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, wondering about her story. Who was she? What had brought her to the palace gates with such unwavering purpose? And why did her presence feel like more than just another tourist visit? The questions followed him into sleep, and when he woke the next morning, Mitchell felt an unusual sense of anticipation. As he prepared for his shift, adjusting his uniform with the same meticulous care he always employed, he found himself hoping he would see the girl again. Something told him her story was far from over, and somehow he was meant to be part of whatever was coming next. The rain had stopped overnight, and pale morning sunlight filtered through the London clouds as Mitchell took his position at the palace gates. He scanned the gathering crowd with practiced eyes, searching for a small figure in a faded blue coat. His heart jumped when he spotted her, standing in exactly the same spot as the day before, teddy bear in her arms, watching the guards with those impossibly knowing eyes. The second day brought with it a sense of urgency that Mitchell couldn't ignore. The little girl stood at her usual spot, but something had changed. Her mother was nowhere to be seen, and the child appeared to be alone. This violation of common sense, a 7-year-old unattended near one of London's busiest tourist attractions, sent alarm bells ringing in Mitchell's mind. Yet the girl seemed perfectly composed, as if being alone was part of some carefully laid plan. Throughout the morning, Mitchell found his attention constantly drawn to her. She had positioned herself directly in his line of sight, and he began to notice patterns in her behavior that he had missed the previous day. Every 30 minutes, she would perform that same silent salute, hand to heart, then extended toward the palace. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, timed, purposeful. She was trying to communicate something. Around midday, Mitchell observed the girl reach into her coat pocket and pull out a piece of paper. She held it up briefly, angled toward the guards, before quickly tucking it away again. The movement was subtle, easily missed by the casual observer, but Mitchell had been watching. The paper appeared to have writing on it, though he couldn't make out the details from his distance. The crowd ebbed and flowed around the girl, but she remained constant, a small island of determination in a sea of tourists. A group of elderly women tried to engage her in conversation, asking about her parents and whether she was lost. The girl smiled politely and shook her head, pointing vaguely toward the crowd as if to indicate her guardians were nearby. The women moved on, but Mitchell noticed how skillfully the child had deflected their concern without actually lying. As the afternoon wore on, Mitchell became increasingly troubled. Protocol demanded that he remain at his post, maintain his composure, and avoid interaction with the public under any circumstances. The Queen's Guard was not a social service. They were ceremonial protectors bound by centuries of tradition. Yet every instinct he possessed as a human being told him this situation was not normal, that this child needed help. During his brief break, Mitchell approached his commanding officer, Sergeant Major Harrison, a stern man with 30 years of service and little patience for breach of protocol. Mitchell explained his observations carefully, emphasizing the child's apparent abandonment and unusual behavior. Harrison listened with his typical stoic expression, then delivered a response that Mitchell had expected but hoped to avoid. "Guardsman Mitchell," Harrison said firmly, "your duty is to your post and to the Crown. Social services and local police handle civilian matters. You are not to engage with members of the public for any reason. Is that understood?" Mitchell nodded, saluted, and returned to his position, but the weight in his chest had only grown heavier. He understood the importance of protocol, respected the chain of command, and valued his position in the Queen's Guard above almost everything else in his life. Yet watching the little girl continue her patient vigil, he felt torn between duty and humanity. Near the end of his shift, something happened that changed everything. The girl had been standing quietly for hours, when suddenly she staggered slightly, catching herself against the iron fence. Mitchell saw her face go pale, saw her grip on the teddy bear loosen momentarily. She was clearly unwell, possibly hadn't eaten all day, and was running on nothing but determination and hope. That's when she did it, the signal that would prompt Mitchell to break centuries of protocol without hesitation. The girl looked directly at him, made eye contact for the first time, and performed a gesture that made his blood run cold. She placed both hands over her heart, then slowly, deliberately, brought them to her throat in what could only be interpreted as a sign of distress. It wasn't a game or childish play acting. It was a desperate plea for help from someone who had no other options. Mitchell's training told him to remain immobile, to report the incident through proper channels, to maintain the dignity of his position. But his humanity overruled his training. This child was in genuine distress, possibly in danger, and she had chosen him as her lifeline. The weight of that trust was not something he could ignore. Breaking protocol for the first time in his career, Mitchell took a step forward. It was small, barely noticeable to most observers, but it was a clear breach of his duties as a Queen's Guard. The girl's eyes widened with hope, and she nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding that her message had been received. Mitchell knew he was taking an enormous risk. His actions could result in disciplinary action, possible dismissal from the Guard, and the end of a military career he had worked years to achieve. The Queen's Guard was not just a job, it was an honor, a calling, a connection to hundreds of years of British military tradition. Breaking protocol was not taken lightly. Yet as he looked at the little girl's pale face and desperate eyes, Mitchell realized that some things transcended protocol. Some situations demanded that a person choose between following rules and following conscience. This was clearly one of those moments, and Mitchell made his choice without further hesitation. The girl reached into her pocket again and pulled out the piece of paper. This time, she held it up long enough for Mitchell to see it clearly. In childish handwriting, carefully formed letters spelled out a simple message: "Help me." Below that, in what appeared to be a different hand, possibly an adult's, were the words "unsafe" and an address in central London. Mitchell's heart pounded as the full implications of the situation became clear. This wasn't a lost tourist or an overzealous royal watcher. This was a child in genuine danger, someone who had come to the palace guards because she saw them as protectors, as people who could help when no one else would or could. The girl carefully folded the paper and put it back in her pocket, then performed her salute one more time. But this time, she added something new. She pointed to herself, then to Mitchell, then toward the palace gates, as if indicating that she was entrusting herself to his protection. The gesture was both heartbreaking and empowering, a reminder of the real purpose behind all the ceremony and tradition. Mitchell knew he had to act, but he also knew he had to be smart about it. Racing from his post would help no one and would likely result in his immediate removal from duty. Instead, he began to formulate a plan that would allow him to help the child while minimizing the breach of protocol. It wouldn't be easy, and it would require courage he wasn't entirely sure he possessed, but the alternative, watching this child disappear into potential danger, was unacceptable. As his shift neared its end, Mitchell caught the attention of Guardsman Peters, his relief officer. Using a series of subtle signals developed during their time serving together, Mitchell indicated an emergency situation requiring immediate but discreet response. Peters, a good man with solid instincts, nodded his understanding and prepared to take action that would support whatever Mitchell was planning. The little girl remained at her post, watching Mitchell with eyes that held both hope and fear. She seemed to understand that something was about to happen, that the silent communication between them had reached a critical point. Her grip on the teddy bear tightened, and Mitchell could see her small frame trembling slightly, whether from cold, hunger, or fear. He couldn't tell. Mitchell checked his watch, calculated the timing, and made his final decision. In just a few minutes, he would do something that went against everything he had been trained to do as a member of the Queen's Guard. He would break protocol, risk his career, and potentially face serious consequences. But he would also save a child who had nowhere else to turn, and that made every risk worthwhile. The moment of truth arrived as the afternoon shift change approached. Mitchell had spent the last hour of his duty carefully observing the little girl while formulating his plan. She had grown noticeably weaker, swaying slightly on her feet, and he realized that time was running out. Whatever situation she was fleeing from, whatever had driven her to seek help from the Queen's Guard, she wouldn't be able to maintain her vigil much longer. As Guardsman Peters approached to take over the post, Mitchell made a decision that would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Instead of following the standard protocol of a silent, ceremonial changing of the guard, he broke ranks entirely. In full view of dozens of tourists and several security cameras, Mitchell stepped away from his post and walked directly toward the palace gates where the little girl stood. The crowd fell silent. Cameras stopped clicking, and even the most seasoned palace watchers stared in disbelief. A Queen's Guard simply did not abandon his post, did not interact with civilians, did not break the solemn dignity that had defined the position for centuries. Yet there was Mitchell, striding purposefully toward a small child with an expression of determination that brooked no argument. The girl's face lit up with a mixture of relief and amazement as Mitchell approached the fence that separated them. He couldn't leave the palace grounds without official permission, but he could speak to her through the iron bars. Protocol be damned, this child needed help, and he was going to provide it. "What's your name?" Mitchell asked quietly, his voice gentle but urgent. The formal ceremonial mask had fallen away completely, replaced by genuine human concern. "Emma," the girl whispered, pressing closer to the fence. "Emma Thompson. I've been waiting for someone to help me. I thought maybe the guards would know what to do." "You were right to come here, Emma," Mitchell said, crouching down to be at her eye level. "Can you tell me what's wrong? Why do you need help?" Emma glanced around nervously, then pulled out the piece of paper again. Through the fence, she handed it to Mitchell, who read it quickly. Along with the "Help Me" message, there was an address and some additional information that made Mitchell's blood run cold. In careful adult handwriting, someone had written, "Cannot go home. Dangerous man there. Mother scared. Police don't believe us." "Who wrote this?" Mitchell asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "My mum," Emma replied. "She's hiding nearby, watching to make sure I'm safe. But she can't come with me because he might see her. She said the guards at the palace are good people who protect everyone, even little girls like me." Mitchell felt a surge of pride at the faith this family had placed in the Queen's Guard, followed immediately by determination to prove that faith was well-founded. He looked around quickly and spotted a woman partially concealed behind a newsstand about 50 yards away. She was watching the interaction between Mitchell and Emma with obvious anxiety, ready to intervene if necessary, but clearly hoping that help had finally arrived. "Emma, I need you to listen very carefully," Mitchell said. "I'm going to help you and your mother, but I need to do it the right way. Can you be brave for just a little bit longer?" The little girl nodded solemnly, clutching her teddy bear. "I've been brave for a long time. Mummy says I'm the bravest girl in London." Mitchell stood and signaled to Guardsman Peters, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing understanding. Peters immediately contacted the palace security office, while Mitchell continued talking to Emma, keeping her calm and engaged. Within minutes, Inspector Sarah Collins from the Metropolitan Police arrived, along with a social worker named Mrs. Henderson, who specialized in domestic abuse cases. What followed was a carefully orchestrated rescue operation that would become a model for how traditional institutions could adapt to modern human needs. Inspector Collins approached Emma's mother, who broke down in tears of relief when she realized that help had finally arrived. The story that emerged was heartbreaking, but sadly common. An abusive partner who had escalated his threats, a mother desperate to protect her child, and a system that had initially failed to take their fears seriously. Emma's mother, Sarah, explained that she had brought her daughter to the palace because she remembered her own father telling her stories about how the Queen's Guard were sworn to protect everyone in Britain, not just the royal family. It was a childlike interpretation of their duty, but it had proven to be more accurate than Sarah could have imagined. Mitchell learned that Emma and her mother had been living in a women's shelter, but the man Sarah was fleeing had discovered their location. Afraid to return to their temporary accommodation and feeling that their previous reports to police hadn't been taken seriously enough, Sarah had decided to bring Emma to the one place in London where she felt certain they would find protection. The teddy bear Emma carried everywhere, it turned out, had belonged to her grandmother and contained a small recording device where Sarah had documented some of the threats they had received. It was evidence that would prove crucial in ensuring their safety and holding their tormentor accountable. Inspector Collins immediately initiated emergency protection protocols, arranging for secure accommodation for Emma and Sarah while launching a full investigation into their case. Mrs. Henderson ensured that Emma received medical attention for the effects of stress and lack of proper nutrition, while also arranging counseling services for both mother and daughter. Mitchell's breach of protocol could have resulted in serious disciplinary action, but when Sergeant Major Harrison learned the full story, he made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Rather than court-martial proceedings, Mitchell received a formal commendation for upholding the highest traditions of service through decisive action in protection of British citizens. The incident prompted a review of palace security protocols, resulting in new procedures for handling emergency situations involving members of the public. While the ceremonial aspects of the Queen's Guard remained unchanged, provision was made for humane response to genuine emergencies. 3 months later, Emma and her mother attended a special ceremony at the palace where Mitchell received his commendation. Emma, healthy and smiling, wore a new blue coat and still carried her grandmother's teddy bear. She presented Mitchell with a drawing she had made of him standing guard, with the words, "My hero," written in careful letters across the bottom. "Thank you for listening to my signal," Emma said, as she shook Mitchell's hand with the serious dignity of someone far older than her years. "Thank you for being brave enough to ask for help," Mitchell replied, "and for reminding me that sometimes the most important protocol is simply being human." Years later, when Mitchell told this story to new recruits, he would always emphasize that the greatest honor of serving in the Queen's Guard wasn't the ceremony or tradition, but the opportunity to embody the very best of what those traditions represented. Emma's silent signal hadn't just prompted him to break protocol, it had reminded him why the protocol existed in the first place: to protect and serve the people of Britain, all of them, even a frightened little girl with nowhere else to turn. Emma grew up to become a police officer herself, inspired by the day when a guard in a red coat and bearskin hat chose compassion over convention and changed her life forever. She never forgot the lesson that sometimes the most important communication happens in silence, and that true strength lies not in following rules blindly, but in knowing when those rules must bend to serve a higher purpose. Mitchell continued his distinguished service with the Queen's Guard, eventually rising to the rank of Sergeant Major himself. But he always said that the most important moment of his military career was the day he stepped away from his post to help a little girl who believed that the guards at the palace were there to protect everyone, and who turned out to be absolutely right.